Picture a tanker sitting still in open water, engines running, cargo full, not moving. For weeks, ships like this one sat scattered across the Strait of Hormuz, waiting for permission that never quite arrived. That image tells you almost everything about the Iran-US conflict right now. The guns have mostly gone quiet, but something else hasn't stopped at all. In February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air campaign against Iran, striking nuclear infrastructure, missile production sites, and senior military leadership. Iran's supreme leader was killed in the opening days. What followed was months of missile exchanges, attacks on U.S. bases across the Gulf, a near-total shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, and a parallel war in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. By early April, mediators in Pakistan had brokered a pause. By mid-June, that pause had a name: a 14-point memorandum of understanding, signed remotely by the American and Iranian presidents. That sounds like an ending. It isn't. Both governments agreed to stop shooting long enough to start arguing about everything else. The memorandum set a 60-day window to resolve what the war never did. Who controls the Strait of Hormuz? What happens to Iran's nuclear program? Whether frozen Iranian assets get released? And whether the fighting in Lebanon stays contained? Every question remains open, and how each side is quietly answering them, in disputes over inspection access and shipping fees, may be a bigger story than the war itself. This isn't the first time these navies have stared each other down in these waters. In 1988, the U.S. carried out Operation Praying Mantis after a mine strike on an American vessel. Tensions flared again in 2011, 2012, and 2019. Every episode ended the same way: de-escalation, ambiguity, no lasting resolution over who controls the Gulf. That pattern is exactly what this ceasefire risks repeating, at a far larger scale. The war began February 28, 2026, under strikes later labeled Operation Epic Fury. According to the House of Commons Library and independent trackers, Israeli and American aircraft hit nuclear sites, missile facilities, and senior commanders in a single coordinated wave. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was among those killed. Within days, Iran retaliated against Israeli cities and American installations in Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. Hezbollah opened a second front from Lebanon. Israel responded with ground operations there too. The region went from tense to fully at war in about a week. Reports also indicate that between February 15th and 20th, Iran sharply increased its oil exports, reportedly tripling shipment pace. Analysts offer competing readings: that Iranian officials anticipated the strikes and raced to move oil before a blockade, or that it reflected ordinary seasonal trading. Public reporting doesn't establish which is correct, but the timing is a detail analysts keep revisiting. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Before the war, roughly a fifth of the world's traded oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas passed through daily. On March 4th, Iran announced the strait closed. Iranian naval forces reportedly laid mines and boarded merchant vessels. Within weeks, the International Maritime Organization reported thousands of stranded sailors and nearly 2,000 idle ships. That is the physical picture. The diplomatic picture is where this gets complicated. On March 25th, Pakistani officials delivered a 15-point American proposal to Tehran: end enrichment, limit missile development, reopen the strait, eventual sanctions relief. Iran rejected it. Tehran's counterproposal demanded an end to strikes on its territory and allied groups, security guarantees, war reparations, and formal recognition of authority over Hormuz. Two governments, each handing the other a document neither intended to sign. Not a negotiation. Two militaries deciding how long to keep fighting while pretending to talk. By early April, with mediation from Pakistan and quiet involvement from China, both sides accepted something short of peace: a temporary ceasefire, extended more than once at Pakistan's request. Vice President Vance called it a fragile truce, not a resolution. That phrase held for months. Then, on June 17th, Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding, according to CNN's review of the released text. Trump signed at the Palace of Versailles during a dinner with the French president after the G7 summit. Pezeshkian signed separately in Tehran. Two leaders, two locations, one document, stitched together at a distance. It's a fitting image for how disconnected this entire process has been. The memorandum set a 60-day negotiating period and 4 working groups, according to Iranian state media citing Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Gharbibadi: sanctions, nuclear affairs, reconstruction, and monitoring and enforcement. On paper, a real structure, but that assumes something nobody can verify: whether either side actually intends to implement what the document says, or whether it's simply a mechanism to manage the war's aftermath without appearing to have lost. Look at what happened almost immediately after the ink dried. Picture negotiators arriving at a lakeside resort in Switzerland, the Bergenstock Resort above Lake Lucerne, for the first real round of technical talks in late June. Vance led the American delegation. Qatari and Pakistani mediators shuttled messages since talks remained largely indirect. According to NPR, CBS News, and others, negotiators reported progress on 4 fronts: reopening the strait, a deconfliction cell for Lebanon, a communication channel to prevent naval incidents in the Gulf, and, most significantly, an apparent Iranian agreement to let IAEA inspectors back in. That last point immediately fractured into 2 competing versions of reality. Vance called it a major milestone toward permanently ending Iran's nuclear weapons program. Trump went further online, describing Iran's inspection commitment as agreed into infinity. Open-ended international oversight of Tehran's most sensitive infrastructure. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman said within a day that no such arrangement existed. The nuclear issue had barely come up in Switzerland, with no inspection scheduled and no meeting planned with the IAEA's Director General. A week later, Iran's chief negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Khalibaf, went further still. On Iranian state television, July 1st, he called reports of expanded access false, saying Iranian law barred inspectors from any site damaged in the war. Access would remain limited to exactly 2 facilities: the Bushehr power plant and the Tehran research reactor. Nothing beyond that. So the American vice president calls nuclear inspections a done deal, and Iran's own lead negotiator calls that claim a lie on state television within days. Both can't be fully accurate. Independent verification of what was actually agreed in Switzerland isn't publicly available. What we know is that 2 governments are describing the same meetings in fundamentally incompatible ways. Whether from miscommunication, posturing, or a deal never actually finalized, the public record doesn't say. Now, the water itself. Before the war, around 120 vessels passed through the strait daily. By late June, according to maritime tracker Kepler, that had crept to 35 vessels on the busiest day since the war began. Real movement, but barely a third of pre-war traffic, and likely an undercount since some vessels reportedly transited with transponders switched off. The memorandum specifies Iran will make its best efforts to allow toll-free passage for 60 days. That phrase is doing a lot of work. A conditional promise, not a guarantee. Almost immediately, Iran signaled it wouldn't honor even that. Iranian and Omani officials issued a joint statement about jointly managing the strait, including costs associated with maritime services. In plain language, fees. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in the UAE for talks with Gulf allies, rejected that outright. No country has the right to toll an international waterway. Here's the deeper question, bigger than shipping fees. For decades, Hormuz operated as an open international passage, contested in principle but functional in practice. If Iran succeeds in establishing a permanent fee structure backed by Oman, that's a meaningful shift in how the world's most important energy choke point is governed. Iran converting a wartime blockade into a peacetime revenue mechanism, embedding leverage into the structure of global trade rather than losing it once the shooting stopped. Whether that holds or gets abandoned once the clock runs out is unclear. Some analysts see Iran extracting a face-saving economic win from a war it otherwise lost. Others see brinkmanship aimed at concessions elsewhere, particularly frozen assets. Which brings us to the money. Roughly $100 billion in Iranian assets remain frozen under American sanctions. Treasury has already begun waiving some sanctions on Iranian crude sales. But what happens to the frozen $100 billion remains the single largest point of leverage either side holds. Vance offered a detail that sounds mundane but reveals how Washington sees this deal. Unfrozen funds, he said, would go toward purchasing American corn, wheat, and soy. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman responded with visible irritation. Tehran has no current demand for American crops, and any purchasing would be based on price and quality, not politics. He added that a war fought by its stated goal to dismantle Iranian civilization had somehow ended with a proposal to enrich American farmers. Sharp commentary and a clear picture of how mismatched the two sides' priorities have become. There's a mirror image layer to the Hormuz standoff. For roughly 6 weeks, mid-April to late May, the U.S. reportedly maintained its own blockade of Iranian ports, two navies sealing off each other's coastlines, each blaming the other. Trump eventually posted that the strait was fully open from the American side, while insisting U.S. naval presence would remain until talks concluded. Iran responded by closing the strait again in mid-April, citing Washington's refusal to lift its own blockade first. Each side conditioning de-escalation on the others, a pattern that recurs throughout this story. By early May, according to The Guardian and others, Trump had ordered American warships to escort commercial vessels through the blockade, effectively daring Iranian forces to interfere with a convoy under direct U.S. protection. That could have triggered direct confrontation at any moment. It didn't. But the attempt shows how close to the edge both militaries were operating, even as diplomats elsewhere talked frameworks and working groups. A third front gets far less attention than the Strait or the nuclear question, but may be just as dangerous. Lebanon. Picture southern Lebanon in early summer 2026. Israeli ground forces occupying parts of the south, Hezbollah rocket teams on terrain they've used for 2 decades, a ceasefire technically in place since a deal brokered around the same time as the broader memorandum. Within days of that ceasefire, Israeli strikes killed at least 16 people according to Lebanese officials, and fighting resumed almost as quickly as it stopped. The memorandum's 4th working group was meant to manage exactly this through a Lebanon deconfliction cell, jointly facilitated by Qatar and Pakistan, a communication channel fast enough to stop a single skirmish from reigniting a regional war. But that assumes Israel and Hezbollah actually want the ceasefire to hold, a separate question from whether Iran and the U.S. do. Iran has repeatedly tied any comprehensive nuclear sanctions deal to a full, lasting truce in Lebanon. If Israeli operations continue, even sporadically, Tehran has signaled it may treat that as grounds to walk away from the broader agreement. 2 governments negotiating while a third and fourth actor keep fighting on a separate battlefield, either side could use as a pretext to abandon the whole framework. Now, the technical layer, where the most consequential ambiguity lives. Iran suspended its formal nuclear weapons program in 2003, but by December 2024, the IAEA had already reported enrichment approaching weapons-grade purity, alongside a stockpile of highly enriched uranium with no clear civilian justification. The combination analysts call breakout capacity, the technical ability to produce fissile material for multiple weapons on short notice without necessarily having built one. The February strikes reportedly targeted that infrastructure. What isn't publicly confirmed is how much enrichment capacity or existing stockpiles survived. Verification requires physical inspection of the damaged sites, and Iran currently restricts access to only 2 facilities. Neither hit hardest by the war. That's the entire dispute in one sentence. Nobody outside Iran's government knows, with confirmed certainty, how much enriched uranium remains, where it is, or what condition it's in. Trump's team asserts a resolution. Iran's negotiators assert the opposite. The evidence doesn't support a firm conclusion either way. One read, the program was set back significantly, and Iran's refusal on access is about preserving leverage for the sanctions talks ahead. Another, the strikes destroyed buildings and personnel but not necessarily the enriched material itself, some of which may have been moved before or during the bombing, and the refusal is about concealing what happened to it. Neither can currently be confirmed. Real verification would mean IAEA teams gaining sustained access to bombed sites, cross-referencing against pre-war inventories, without Iranian officials controlling what gets shown. A slow, unglamorous process, nothing like the instant milestone Trump described online. Even in the best case, credible verification would take months. Right now, the two sides can't agree whether the process has even begun. Here's a detail that doesn't fit neatly into either narrative. Iran's own leadership structure appears internally divided. According to the House of Commons Library, Mojtaba Khamenei, who holds ultimate authority over Iran's security establishment, said he holds a different view than President Pezeshkian on the June memorandum, and reportedly agreed to let it proceed only after assurances that the interests of Iran's armed regional allies, the Resistance Front, would be protected. That's a real crack in the picture both governments paint publicly. Washington isn't negotiating with a single unified Iran, but a coalition of institutions and personalities who may not agree on how far to bend. A deal Pezeshkian's diplomats accept in Switzerland could still be undermined domestically by hardliners or contradicted by figures like Kalibaf. There's a domestic Israeli dimension, too. Polling reported by Iran International during the war suggested most Israelis opposed the ceasefire, believing the campaign should have continued until the regime was gone. Some Israeli officials publicly called the ceasefire a mistake, and Al Monitor later reported tension within Netanyahu's own circle, with aides privately faulting the American president for pulling back before regime change could be completed. If accurate, Washington and its closest regional ally may not have agreed on what victory even looked like, and a ceasefire negotiated without full Israeli buy-in is one Israel has less incentive to fully respect, particularly in Lebanon, where its forces operate independently of whatever Washington and Tehran agree to on paper. Widen the lens. The Gulf Cooperation Council, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE issued a joint statement in June, insisting lasting peace requires addressing the full spectrum of Iran's threats. Not just the nuclear question, but its missile arsenal, drones, and support for armed groups. In careful diplomatic language, the Gulf states most exposed to Iranian retaliation are telling Washington a narrow deal focused on uranium and shipping fees won't solve the underlying problem. Rubio's tour through the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain was, per State Department statements, specifically about reassuring these governments the stakes extend beyond the immediate ceasefire. There's also a quieter international dimension. Iran International reported Washington officials confirming Chinese diplomats were involved in the truce negotiations that led to April's original pause, alongside Pakistan. China has deep economic ties to Iran, especially oil purchases that continued through the harshest sanctions years. A durable Chinese role would mean Washington is no longer the only outside power shaping Iran's options. Whether that continues or fades isn't settled by the public record. Iranian officials also reportedly maintained contact with Hamas throughout the negotiating period, discussing what state media described only as the latest developments. Thin, deliberately so, but a reminder that the memorandum doesn't exist in a vacuum. Iran's broader network of allied armed groups, from Lebanon to Gaza to Iraq, gives Tehran leverage that shows up nowhere in the 14-point text, and that Washington can't constrain through a bilateral agreement alone. Now the cost of simply maintaining this posture. The Pentagon has reportedly told Congress it needs roughly $80 billion, largely to cover expenses from the war against Iran. That hasn't yet been formally requested, but Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has already been lobbying lawmakers directly. $80 billion suggests the American military establishment is planning for sustained regional commitment, not a quick exit. That's the tension under every handshake. Public diplomacy says peace. Private budgeting suggests a much longer, costlier entanglement. So where does this leave things at the start of July 2026? The 60-day window runs out in mid-August. The 4 working groups are technically active. A reported reconstruction fund, potentially worth up to $300 billion financed by regional partners, was reportedly discussed but never formally detailed in the memorandum's public text, according to NPR's reporting on unpublished provisions. If accurate, that's one of the largest post-conflict rebuilding commitments in recent Middle Eastern history. But its existence rests on sourcing that hasn't been independently confirmed. Shipping through Hormuz has partially recovered but remains roughly a third of pre-war volume, with the fee dispute unresolved. Nuclear inspections, fully agreed by one side's account, barely discussed by the others, haven't visibly begun. Lebanon's ceasefire has held only intermittently, punctuated by strikes that have already killed civilians since the truce was announced. The real question isn't whether the war formally restarts. Wars like this rarely restart with a single dramatic event. It's whether either government has the internal cohesion and external patience to turn a 60-day pause into something that survives contact with its own domestic politics. Consider the asymmetry. The United States can walk away at relatively limited domestic cost. Sanctions relief can be slow-walked, inspections can wait, and American voters aren't tracking a Hormuz fee dispute. Iran is negotiating under the weight of a devastated economy, a leadership transition after its supreme leader's death, a fractured domestic consensus, and a population that lived through months of direct strikes. The pressure isn't symmetrical. Whether that pushes Iran toward faster concessions or makes its negotiators more rigid out of domestic necessity is genuinely uncertain. Picture, once more, that stalled tanker. By late June, it might have finally moved, 35 ships crossing on a single day, more than at any point since the war began. Real, measurable progress, but less than a third of what used to be routine. Somewhere between total blockade and full normal operation sits the actual state of this ceasefire, functioning just enough to look like progress, incomplete enough to leave every major dispute technically unresolved. One last detail captures the strange, almost bureaucratic texture this conflict has settled into. In the same Truth Social post confirming no tolls on the strait for the initial 60 days, Trump added a warning. Afterward, the United States itself might begin charging its own tolls, framing the American military presence in the Gulf as a service rendered. A protection fee owed by the region for what he called acting as its guardian angel. A war that began with strikes aimed at regime change and nuclear disarmament has, within months, narrowed to a dispute that increasingly resembles a commercial toll negotiation, with both Washington and Tehran positioning themselves as the rightful party to charge a fee on the same stretch of water. That shift from existential war aims to shipping tariffs is either a sign of genuine de-escalation, two exhausted powers settling into manageable friction, or a sign the underlying conflict was never really about oil routes and inspection regimes at all, And those issues are simply the terrain on which a much larger, unresolved contest over regional dominance, nuclear capability, and who gets to write the rules of the Gulf is now being fought by other means. The 60-day clock is still running as this story is being told. What happens when it expires, comprehensive deal, further extension, or collapse back into open conflict, depends on questions the public record cannot answer yet. How much of Iran's nuclear material actually survived the war? Whether Tehran's competing power centers can agree on a single negotiating position? Whether Israel and Hezbollah can be kept from reigniting Lebanon? And whether either Washington or Tehran genuinely wants a lasting settlement rather than simply the appearance of one? That last question may be the one that matters most. And it's the one nobody involved has any incentive to answer honestly in public.